On this episode of Doing the Most, we're revisiting our recipe for our crispy Session Mead.
Homemade brews and very sour brews, everything from mead to roast. Bake creation, fermentation, inebriation, doing the most.
A Session Mead, or Hydromel, is a pretty difficult thing to balance. And this recipe that we released last year seems to be one of the most popular recipes on our YouTube channel. That said, there are some minor tweaks we'd recommend to the recipe because we've brewed quite a bit of it over the last year, and with every batch, we learn a little something new. Additionally, our original video showed how to brew this up for a keg. We're going to show you both bottle conditioning and kegging in this video. Now, before we get into the recipe, I want to make note of a couple of things. This version uses a little bit more honey than the previous version, and also there's the addition of citric acid, just a tiny amount of citric acid to help balance the acid profile. So let's take a look at the ingredients. The ingredients for this crispy Session Mead are 6 pounds of good honey, 3 grams of malic acid, 1 gram of citric acid, 3 grams of wine tannin, and D47 wine yeast. To back sweeten, if kegging, use 1 pound of honey, or if bottling and bottle conditioning, use 12 ounces of erythritol. Now, a couple of things. We typically recommend orange blossom honey and D47 wine yeast for this recipe. However, any kind of fruity flavored honey seems to work pretty well in this. We've tried it with orange blossom honey, blueberry honey, even sourwood honey. As long as there's a delicate fruity floralness to your honey, this recipe should work pretty well. I wouldn't recommend it for honeys like eucalyptus or alfalfa or buckwheat or bochet honey. This really needs a nice delicate fruity honey. So if it's going to be your first time brewing a Session Mead, I'd recommend just getting a good quality orange blossom honey to start with. For this Hydromel, we are using sourwood honey from Honey Next Door. Now typically I would use D47 wine yeast, but here in this special circumstance, I'm using a slurry of Sundew ale yeast from Omega, because I had it on hand and I really like the juicy flavors that it added to this Hydromel the last time I used it. And as I said, we typically recommend D47 yeast for this because it's a nice, crisp, clean fermenter that'll take you all the way to the finish line. However, I have started to become a fan of Omega's Sundew ale yeast in this recipe because it gives a nice juiciness to back up the honey flavor. Another really simple and accessible choice would be EC1118 or QA23. And some folks on our Discord have had good experience using Kveik ale yeast and getting it hot so you get some of those interesting esters and flavors out of the Kveik. For example, you might want to use Kveik Voss, which I've found to give nice citrusy notes, like zesty notes, when you ferment it hot. So I'm adding just a little bit of spring water and giving it some go firm so it can wake back up as I mix up my other ingredients. I'll put a link to information about Go Firm in the description of this video. So while our yeast are coming to room temperature and getting to know each other, we're going to add our honey. Each of these containers is 2 pounds of honey. I'm going to empty them all out, fill them up with water and give them a good shake, and then empty that out to make sure I get all the honey out of there. Then in goes our wine tannin, our citric acid, and our malic acid. And then we just top this up with water. Stir, stir, stir. And I believe it's very important to front load your nutrients on a Session Mead. So I'm putting a full 10 grams of Fermented O in right at the start. And that's a little higher than I would typically use for an ale yeast, but I found that this ale yeast really needs a little bit more nutrient to get over the finish line. I'll put a link in the description to information about how you can calculate the nutrients for your meads. Now, typically we recommend using a staggered nutrient schedule when making your meads. However, for this one, we actually recommend front loading your nutrient all at the beginning. And for this ale yeast, I use 10 grams of Fermented O right at the beginning, but for a typical wine yeast, I find that like 8 grams of Fermented O up front is plenty to get you over the finish line. However, Sundew ale yeast, the one I'm using in this video, actually has a little bit higher of a nutrient requirement when fermenting honey. Nutrients are very important when making a Session Mead, specifically because you've got not a whole lot going on in there. It's a lot of water and a little bit of honey. In this recipe, I have found myself, and I have heard from others, can develop a hydrogen sulfide fault, meaning that you get a little bit of those rotten egg smells in there. Now, we've got a video on how to fix that, But the best way to prevent it is to give proper nutrient to your session mead must, so it has everything it needs to finish up a healthy fermentation. Ferment dough goes in, and then our yeast slurry goes in. Then we'll give that another good stir, stir, stir. Take a sip from our current batch of session mead, delicious, and get a hydrometer reading. This recipe typically mixes up to a starting gravity of between 1.042 and 1.045. Nailed it. And then we put that away for a week or so. Another thing we like about this recipe is it can be fruited, and it doesn't take a whole lot of fruit to impart some interesting and light flavors. I'm talking like 4 to 7 pounds of fruit. I would recommend doing your fruit in secondary and use something nice like raspberries or blueberries or blackberries or mango or pineapple. Something that's going to introduce a distinct flavor, but not something that's necessarily going to detract from the honey flavor in this brew. If you're going to fruit this recipe, you might want to go ahead and balance your acids after secondary, after you've taken the fruit out, rather than per the recipe in primary, because those fruits are going to bring some acids with them, and you might not need additional acid, or you may need a different kind of acid in order to balance it. For more on balancing, check out our how to make a great mead video. And my next foray into this is going to be dry hopping it, and I am excited for that. Once it is fermented all the way out to 1.000 or lower, we'll rack that off the yeast keg. As I mentioned previously, there's an extra pound of honey in primary in this version of the recipe versus what we posted last year. And I find that if you're back sweetening with erythritol, that extra pound of honey, while it does dial up your ABV just a touch, it helps keep those honey flavors forward if you're back sweetening with a sweetener that's not honey, like erythritol. I've had a lot of different batches of this recipe, and I can say fairly confidently that I could probably not tell the difference in a triangle test between a batch back sweetened with erythritol and a batch that has been stabilized and back sweetened with honey. That said, you can often get honey quite a bit cheaper than erythritol. So if you're kegging, back sweetening with honey can be a more economical choice, and also kind of keeps it more within that mead band than something that would be back sweetened with erythritol. Some folks, some of my friends included, may bat an eye at the use of erythritol. However, if you're bottle conditioning, I do believe that erythritol is the best, most neutral non-fermentable sweetener you can use to reinforce the honey flavors in that product. And who knows, you may actually like it dry, so you might taste test it before you back sweeten it. One final note on back sweetening: please do not use artificial sweeteners or stevia. We have tried them and it tastes terrible. I promise. I promise. And now let's weigh out our erythritol. This is a non-fermentable sweetener, so we can bottle condition with this. Weighing out 12 ounces, and then while I'm racking off the mead, I'm gonna go ahead and put my funnel in there and pour the erythritol in. Those will just mix together as our mead racks over. Then give it a nice gentle stir, 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 which will both degas and help mix in our erythritol. And then place it back under airlock. And because we are keeping our colony of Sundew ale yeast, I poured it off into a jar to put into the fridge for later. Once everything's had time to come together, I added some sparkaloid, which is a hot mix fining agent. A fining agent just helps your mead go clear. So I'm pouring that directly into the session mead, and that will grab onto the larger particles, help them clump together, and drop to the bottom. Usually my batches of this session mead go from yeast pitch to drinking in less than a month. It really hits drinkable at about 3 weeks, but usually I need another week or so to get it clear. If you would like this to be quick from honey to glass, just make sure you give it proper nutrient, and fining agents are your friend if you want it clear. I find that sparkaloid does a great job cleaning this one up, and I've also seen that folks are using dual fine and gelatin and other things like that to get it clear. It'll be drinkable quick, but if you want it clear quick, you're probably gonna have to use fining agents. And if you don't care about having a lot of polish on your clarity, just barrel on ahead. It should still taste good. A short time later, once it's gone crystal clear, we're ready to bottle condition that. And here I'm bottle conditioning this by adding a carbonation drop, which is just a pre-measured little dose of dextrose. The yeast will consume that, turn it into CO2, which will hang out in suspension, thus carbonating this session mead. And there you have it, 2 cases of delicious, crispy hydromel. Now, you can also keg this, and if kegging it, you can pasteurize or stabilize and add honey, or if you want to roll the dice, just keep it super, super cold so it doesn't re-ferment in the keg. You just rack it directly into the keg once sweetened, purge the headspace at the top, and then set it under pressure for a couple of days. Here I'm putting it under 40 psi for 2 days, shaking intermittently. All right, let's dive in. So there's our bottle condition guy, and fresh off the tap. It smells like honey. It's tart, but you can smell that sweetness, that honey character in there. But it's crisp and crispy. It's got an effervescence, and your brain can identify that it's got like a little pop of acid in there. Like legit makes my mouth water. For real, one of my favorite things. It's just so good. It's so good. So what I love about this recipe is the acid balancing works really well with a delicate and fruity honey. So for example, the sourwood honey has a very distinct flavor as a honey, and it tastes like that honey when it hits the glass. The tannin helps it ride across your palate so it doesn't feel watery, but the acid gives it an identifier that is really helpful in telling the palate that this is made from honey. It's so nice. The bottle conditioned version has just a little bit of that funk that lets you know that the yeast actually just finished doing some more fermentation in there. Realistically, the bottle conditioned version would be carbonated and ready to drink in 3 to 4 weeks after that cap goes on the bottle. However, because there's so little going on here, there's just that honey forward character. You might leave it just a week, maybe 2 weeks to let that yeast settle out and firm up on the bottom of your bottles. The kegged version, however, is ready and raring to go at 1 month, which I love. It's just so smooth, but so bright. It's kind of like, for lack of a better term, it's kind of like a honey flavored soda. It tastes like honey. It's got that nice little stroke of acid that kind of ties a bow on the whole flavor package. So good, so crushable. Legit, every time David's over here, he's just pouring pints off my kegs before I even realize it. This is actually one of my favorite things in the world. It's hard to not describe this session mead in a way that makes it sound one-dimensional because it's honey flavored, it's honey forward. It's carbonated honey in a glass. But there are layers there, and while they're nuanced layers, they exist as part of a whole. If the tannin wasn't there, if the acid wasn't balanced properly, and if you didn't have a really good and flavorful honey, it would feel disjointed. But as it is, using a honey like sourwood or orange blossom or blueberry blossom, you get a really distinct final product that really shines in the glass. I can't reiterate enough that if you're making a session mead for the first time, you should follow the recipe card, this recipe right here. That's going to be your ticket to getting something super drinkable really quick. Once you've made a good session mead and you feel comfortable with the process, and particularly with how light and delicate it can be, then it's a good time to start expanding on your repertoire. I know there are a lot of you out there who make session meads, so I want to see your recipes and recommendations in the comments here. And if you found this video helpful, make sure to hit that thumbs up and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. And if you have subscribed to the channel already, thank you. Big shout out to our members and patrons who help support the channel. You can become a member by clicking join right below this video you're watching right now. And you can follow us on Instagram and Pinterest at doingthemostokay. Our website's doingthemost.org. We're on Twitch at doingthemostokay, and we have a Discord server at discord.doingthemost.org. And it's an amazing community of people who are super, super helpful. So you should join our Discord if you're looking to make good mead or other fermented drinks. Until next time, crush a crispy boy for me, and happy brewing.